Hello, welcome. My name is Sergio Latorre, and I'm going to be introducing the uh, presenters today. I teach in the Fine Arts Department, and I'd like to know if there are any art students here? Art and architecture students? Any art history, museum studies, design, fine arts, architecture? No? Any faculty here? Faculty? Okay, good. Well, welcome you guys. Yes, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 chairs here. Before we start, I'd like to thank Glory Simmons, the director of the Tasher Gallery. Where are you, Glory? For stand up, please. For putting together such an amazing event, not only the exhibition but also the event today. Thank you, Glory. I also like to thank the all the programs that sponsored this exhibition and also this presentation. The African Studies, the Art History and Arts Management, Department of Art Architecture, European Studies, International Studies, Migration Studies, and Museum Studies. The exhibition was organized by Cranner Art Museum, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and it was made possible in part by the Andy Warhol Foundation for Visual Arts. And it was co-curated by Alison Perura and Allan deSouza. You might talk about that co-curation project here, or no? I also like to make an announcement. There will be two events that are based on the exhibition next door. Tomorrow I'll be leading a tour looking at maps in modern and contemporary practices. And on Monday, September 10th, we have an artist, from 1 to 2:30, an artist walk through an open reception for Paris, new works by Jonathan Anzalone on the sculpture terrace at the K Hall. So if you guys coming for that, September 10, meet in the first floor atrium. So before I introduce Allan, I'll introduce Professor John Zarobell. He's an associate professor and undergraduate director of international studies at USF. Formerly, he held the positions of assistant curator at the SF MoMA and associate curator at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He's a contributor to Artsy, Art Practical, and the San Francisco Art Quarterly, and has written for numerous exhibition catalogs and has curated exhibitions of modern and contemporary art, including Manet and the Sea, 2003, Frida Kahlo, 2008, New Work, Ranjani Shetar, 2009, Art in the Atrium, Kerry James Marshall, 2009, and Indigenous Contemporary in 2015. His first book, Empire of Landscape, was published in 2010, and Art in the Global Economy was published with University of California Press in April 2017. In these studies, Zarobell addresses how globalization has transformed the art world in the past generation. And now our guest tonight, Allan deSouza. He's a California-based multimedia artist and writer. His photography, installation, text, and performance works restage historical evidence through counter strategies of fiction, erase, and mistranslation. I had a pleasure to exhibit with Allan a couple of times, I think, the Merge the Biennial with her name? The curator. Don't worry about
How forgettable those curators
it. we don't like curators, you guys. Artists and curators. And we got grants from the San Francisco Arts Commission in 2010, I believe. His work has been exhibited extensively in the United States and also abroad, including at the Walter Collection in Germany, the Pompidou Center in Paris, 2008 Gwangju Biennale in Korea, the third Wanzhou Triennale in China, the EV Plus A Festival in Ireland. What is EV Plus A?
We're doing so bad in terms of memories today.
Oh, well, okay. Recent solo exhibitions at YBCA here in San Francisco, the Phillips Collection in DC, SF Camera Work, the Fowler Museum in LA, the Cranner Art Museum in Champaign, Illinois, the Talwar Gallery in New York, and Talwar Gallery in Delhi. His writings have been published in various journals, anthologies, and catalogs, including Third Text in London, Wolfgang Art Monthly South Korea, and Extra Los Angeles. He's an associate professor in the Department of Art Practice at UC Berkeley, and he is represented by Talwar Gallery in New York City and New Delhi. Please welcome Allan and John.
let's see. Oh, there we are. It is on, functioning. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming out. It's really nice to see such an excellent audience at one of our events here at USF. And I'm so glad to welcome Allan here. Allan actually came to my class last semester, or I guess that was last year now. Time flies. Last fall, for Museum Studies, when we were working on a South Asian contemporary exhibition in which one of your works was featured. So it's great to have you back and to really get a chance to talk with you about this exhibition, which I saw for the first time in New York, but is expanded here because you didn't have the raft. So let's just dive right in because we're getting started a little late, and I know that we have a reception ahead of us. So, basically, this exhibition chronicles an expedition of a fictional historical character, Hafid Sidi Mubarak Mumbai, right? Can you tell us a little bit about your character that you invented and his expedition?
So, as John mentioned, the expedition is led by Hafid Sidi Mubarak Mumbai, who is the fictional great-great-grandson of Hafid Sidi Mubarak Bombay, who is an actual historical character and was an expedition guide for so many of the British explorers in 19th century Africa. John also is one of the few people who had seen an earlier performance I did actually at the Richmond Arts Center in East Bay, where there were a couple of different elements that had come together in that performance. One, the character of Perubu from Alfred Jarry's play from 1896, I think. And Joseph Beuys, the artist, one of his performances. So I was looking at both the absurdity and absurdism in Jarry's play, and the kind of shamanistic practices of Beuys, and how those two might have come together in this particular character, whose target might have been the bourgeoisie, and certainly that was the case for a lot of the sort of absurdist theatre. And my interest was more the target being a kind of colonizer. And so Hafid is actually an amalgamation of a kind of historical descendant from those two cultural moments, but also an actual historical character. And I think in many ways brings together my different histories, both in terms of family histories and but also artistic histories.
And the expedition, he's looking for?
So he's looking for the source of the River Thames in England. And so the expedition is based on my transcribing Henry Stanley's expedition journals to discover the source of the River Nile. And those journals were published in 1870, 1871. So it's based on, again, another historical document. And so all of Henry Stanley's descriptions of the natives, quote unquote, in East Africa, his descriptions of the landscape and so on, those are transcribed to apply to London. And set in 2016 during the Brexit vote.
So it is now in some sense historical. Obviously 2016 was a historic year in Britain, but it is contemporary too, right? It's sort of taking this historical and making it contemporary. So obviously, like you just said, it is a reversal of a historical expedition in which British people went into Africa seeking, geographical points of interest, but obviously with a lot of, shall we say, baggage, right? In terms of how they were engaging on the continent and the relationship between an expeditionary force and colonial seizure of territory, things like that, right? Now reversing this in 2016, what does this reversal of the expedition help the viewer to see differently about the relationship between Africa and the UK?
Yeah, I've been wondering about that that term sort of reversing or inverting, and John and I sort of mentioned this, talked about this a little bit before, and I kept thinking about Freud's use of the term invert. So Freud using inversion to describe homosexuality as a kind of an opposite, or a sort of turning around. And so I think there's something there, not to put too much emphasis on Freud, but there's something there about deviance. And I don't mean homosexuality or queerness as deviance, but deviance in the sense of taking something that's regarded as a norm, a social norm, and turning it around. And it could be kind of like a group perception, even about a location or about a history, and trying to turn that around. So in terms of London, it's not just a reversal. I think it's to pervert the normalization of colonialism in some ways, and to consider London as a post-colony that is changed by its colonial history as much as the colonies have been changed. And so, what is that view from someone coming from the colonies? How do they remake a place like London in their own image, rather than the kind of convention of migrants going to a new place and having to assimilate to those places? Right. It's like, well, we as migrants, we remake these places we go to. It's not that we only are required to change ourselves to assimilate and adapt. We adapt those places to us. Right. And I think that's a little bit of what I want Hafid to be doing. It's like, how does we change a metropolis like London to consider it as a post-colonial center, right, but totally implicated in its colonial history.
And I mean, in that sense, I think this is the best kind of fantasy in the way that it reinforces an actual reality, right? Post-colonial migration, of course, has transformed London, right. And there's so many pieces of evidence that reinforce that, but it's very interesting the way in which you engage that conversation or engage that social fact, right? And so I want to now turn to some of the works in the show, particularly the maps, right? Because after all, an expedition needs a map. So let me just switch to the first slide here.
Yep. We have images.
I sat on that slide or something, but anyway, I'm cutting across the stage. But
Should we swap?
What's that?
Should we swap?
Oh, sure, why not? There we go.
Kind of our little performance, our little expedition.
There we go. So this work is Borough Boogie Woogie. And there's a little art historical joke there for people who aren't big fans of Piet Mondrian. Broadway Boogie Woogie was a big painting he made when he arrived in New York, fleeing from World War II and the Nazis in Europe at the time. And it is kind of a definitive work for Mondrian. So I take that to be a bit of an art historical nod.
Yeah.
But when we look at this map, which is of a section of London, and then the quay on the side, what are we looking at here? And how, what does this map show?
So it is central London, and if anyone here knows London, at first glance it might just feel completely recognizable. You can see a little bit of the River Thames, some of the main parks in central London, and it takes a little while to dawn on viewers that there's something wrong with the map, not only in terms of the coloration, but it's upside down. And so there is that question of, well, if we live on a globe, there is no up and down, there is no actual north and south. And also that, Hafid's coming from the global south, and And in some ways, so it's to prioritize the South by actually turning it around and giving it that location of privilege, I guess, which is how the North is always privileged. And one of the things about, if you turn it around, then East and West also get switched. And so, do you have any of the other images? But not to go to them yet, but
I have the navigation chart.
Oh, okay.
So I say, basically targeting a handful of images because obviously the whole show is over there. I don't want to give it all
right. But I guess in a couple of the other maps, then it becomes more apparent why East and West are moved around. I mean, it tells you also that North and South are reversed, but also there's a historical reference to Columbus, going west and thinking he's arriving in India.
Right, right.
So the West Indies and the East Indies then get switched around.
Right, the other India, or the other Indians, which is such a relevant issue in California. So what about the color tones, right? The key, what are these
Right, so this
doing?
is Hafid's sort of I guess discoveries, but also actually inventions. I mean, the discovery of a place is a form of inventing it for oneself, to make sense of it for oneself. And so he's making sense of it by essentially segregating the neighborhoods by skin tone and ethnicity. And that's what the key on the side is showing. And then if you do a digital color reversal, for each of these skin tones, and again, quote unquote, you'll get those range of blues and turquoises, which in some ways also becomes a mapping of water depth as well. So it becomes a mapping of his passage also to England.
That I wanted to hear you talk about that because I think that is such a fascinating element of this map that it's very difficult to get necessarily when you're standing in front of it. You see these tones and you're like, wait, those are the reversed tones right next to those, right? And then of course the city is mapped based on skin tone, right? So ethnicity, of course, backgrounds, levels even of migration, and how that relates then to the water depth. That's just wonderful.
Just one small thing, which I guess goes back to navigation chart, is that the street names are removed here, and some letters are left, but they're left as if they're physical roadblocks, as if it's an aerial view of search points and roadblocks. And when you go into the gallery, you'll be able to see those details.
All right, now I will move to the navigation chart, which seems to be all about the names. And the sad thing is, with the reproduction blown up that way, we can't actually read the names. But when you go to the gallery and see the actual piece, you can. The navigation chart, here you've changed the names of all the stations in the London Underground. And I think the reversal is here as well, right? Yes. And you've replaced them with names of either anti-colonial or post-colonial thinkers, right? Figures from poetry to philosophy to political rhetoric, right? Who've been engaged in a kind of colonial history, whether in Britain or elsewhere. Can you speak about the conventions of naming under colonialism and how reversing that process by sort of bringing it to London changes the way we might understand the city?
Okay. Yeah, a couple of the other maps in the gallery are there's one of Kew Gardens and one of London Zoo. And both these are sort of places of collecting during the colonial period, and so collecting is also where you're suggesting that process of renaming comes in, and so I'm kind of interested in how knowledge functions within a kind of colonial system, and if everything gets renamed, and if all forms of knowledge and archive get destroyed, except through the sort of colonial bureaucracy. And so, for the example, that the way I learned art history was essentially European and North American art history. The fact that I only really speak English as well. So these become forms of knowledge which create a worldview. And so I was really interested in this whole process of naming, like you name, if you give it a name, then you erase all the other names. And so there's a kind of other worldviews that are erased. And of course, this is the process that colonization does anyway. And so, what does it mean to rename the locations in London through its colonial history? And you know, as John said, it is an international, I guess, a sort of bringing together of different people. Everyone in the map has died in the 20th or 21st century, most recently till last year. What we used to call Third World First Nation, and so there is a naming that really is from the global south. Even though a lot of people on the map are associated with England, a lot with the US. You know, there are musicians and singers, athletes, a lot of names that you'll know. There's also people in there who've been killed, either in racist attacks, homophobic attacks, transphobic attacks, and also by the police. And so also bringing them into the sort of constellation of cultural workers, political figures, and so on. So in some ways, it's a very personal navigation chart that really spans, in some ways, my lifetime.
Right. I mean, that's one of the things which is, of course, one of the more interesting aspects of this exhibition is the relationship that you have with this fictional character, and that sort of how much of this is Allan versus how much of it is Hafid, right? And I think that's one of the engaging questions for, you know, for literature and art in general, right? The whole idea of writing a novel in the first person, and whether that's actually the author,
Right.
or is that the author's character that the character's invented. And in some ways, you're bringing that literary trope into this exhibition, something, you know, it's not unprecedented, but there's certainly, it's not regular in the art space, and I think that's very fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, one of the tropes within art practice, and you know, we as viewers, we also expect this of artists, that somehow artists are telling the truth about themselves.
Right.
You know, that they're revealing themselves in some, you know, in some way, or they're manifesting themselves through the artwork. And I'm interested in, you know, what is this claim, the truth claim that art makes, but also the truth claims that it makes upon, you know, revealing the artist. And one of the things as an artist of color, you're always expected to speak autobiographically, like to speak only about the things that you've personally experienced, like, you know, family history, migration, you know, race, etc. And there's little space to speak about anything else outside of that. And so the expectation to always speak autobiographically. But autobiography is always fiction. You know, you always select which things to remember, which things to make public, and so on. And so I'm interested in those kinds of constructions about the truth claims and the level of fiction that's actually produced in those truth claims.
Wonderful. So, I mean, let's get right to that, right? Because you made this about the, you know, the expedition takes place at the time of the Brexit vote, right? You are yourself a migrant from Kenya to the UK, now actually a migrant to the US. From one exile to another, I guess. But needless to say, you must have had some personal response or reaction to the Brexit sentiment and that. how does this colonial expedition to the source of the Thames relate to migration into Britain in contemporary time?
Well, one of the references, and it's a sort of passing reference in the exhibition, one of the titles of the piece, the title of one of the pieces, makes a reference to a 1968 speech by a far-right politician, but who was also a politician in government, Enoch Powell, and a kind of infamous speech he gave about the River Tiber and the reference to the River Thames, actually, as the River Tiber that will be flowing red with blood because of the war that migrants are causing. And so, we're seeing this rhetoric happening all over again. This was also around Britain's entry into Europe initially as well. That sort of all those questions around nationalism, about a pure Britain, about making it great again, going back to its sort of colonial heyday, keeping out the immigrants. We just see this replayed over and over at different moments, and so there's a reference back to that, and the same kind of rhetoric that's being played now in Britain, but also here in the US. One of the strange things around Brexit, and while I was there doing research in 2016, was that I didn't feel, as a South Asian, I didn't feel that sort of hatred and xenophobia was being directed at me, strangely enough. It was being directed at Eastern Europeans. And so people, if they were overheard speaking Polish, for example, they were the ones being physically attacked. And 2 Polish people were killed in the time I was there that summer. And so the targets have been different at these different historical moments, but the rhetoric is the same. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm sort of using that moment of Brexit to talk around, I guess to bring again to our attention these questions around migration, how we treat immigrants, the rhetoric of nationalism and xenophobia.
Wonderful. I want to just look at one more piece and ask you a question about it. And this is the raft, although it's been recomposed. It had its presentation at the Cranach Museum in the last iteration of this exhibition. Now it's been rebuilt and remade for this exhibition. What's going on with this raft? It's quite a collection of objects, and we looked at it together last week. It was you showed me various components. There's a shower here, for example, a lamp, a bunch of stored materials, and clearly it's made out of a very elaborate cat's toy paradise, right? How did you think about this raft? How did you determine what elements to include? What would Hafid need on his expedition? What went into that?
So, yes, everyone will recognize these are kiddie condos. And so there's something there about creating these sort of luxury condos for cats and then repurposing them into essentially a migrant shelter. I mean, Hafid is a privileged migrant. He has agency. He's able to travel and to cross borders, and so that's part of the fiction too. But the transforming essentially a cat luxury object into this base camp, I think, and the idea is that it can be built and taken apart as needed, and sort of rebuilt in new locations. And so all the other materials are either found or they're fabricated by me, and they're mostly fabricated using cardboard or duct tape. And duct tape, just because that's what you would use to make temporary fixes, to to repair things in the home. And so the pots and pans, the clothes, the trousers, the jacket, the shoes, and everything, these are all made of duct tape. And they're also meant to, I guess, fall apart over the time, and they probably will start disintegrating during the course of the exhibition. And that's intentional. To work against, I think, the idea that art objects have to be timeless and have to be precious, they have to be everlasting, and so on. So and obviously there's an artistic precedence for that too. So what else? Things you mentioned. The leopard skin. I think there's an image of Hafid in the gallery where he's wearing a leopard skin, and so it plays off that as a symbol of sort of status and power, and to some extent of wealth. But here it's brought into a kind of both the domestic space of the kiddie condo and into the gallery space. So it's a signifier of the wild and the untamed and the jungle and so on. And I'm interested in those things of how we bring the sort of exotic into our domestic spaces, or the wild and the untamed into our domestic spaces by taming them. And of course that being the kind of the justification of the civilizing mission as well, is to tame the savage and bring it into the heartland, into the domestic space, of the motherland. So those things are sort of in play.
There's one of the things we also discussed was the relevance of this raft to other boat travels, right? Particularly Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which mostly takes place on a boat, his search for Marlowe, or something much lighter fare like African Queen, for example, with Humphrey Bogart. So a lot of when we think about sort of the expeditions in Africa, it often refers back to a boat, right? And we talked about what would it take to make the kiddie condos look like a steamship.
Yeah, so that was definitely one of the references. So previous work, I've rewritten Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the novel, and I've done it by changing every word of Conrad's into a word that rhymes with it. And so when you read my version aloud, it sounds like and rhymes with Conrad's version, but mine can also be read aloud, or it can be read as a novel in its own right, and it makes sense as a novel. And so Conrad is a direct reference, and his image of the steamboat as a kind of mobile site of civilization through the literal heart of darkness, through the blackness of the jungle, and of course one of the things that Conrad is both celebrated for and vilified for. Celebrated for his language and his descriptions of the jungle. But that's also what he's vilified for, as a kind of producing an imaginary and a description of racism, right. Actually, like a very vivid racist description of bodies and of territories.
Right, I mean, effectively reflecting European views of Africa at that time, but also in some sense giving it such a clear and decisive articulation, it seems sort of definitive in a way, right?
Yeah.
And then it becomes, of course, a novel that everybody reads in high school, so then it becomes definitive.
Right. Yeah.
And then how hard is it then to take that structure apart, right? That dynamic that's been set up.
Yeah, so many sort of Africanist scholars would suggest to me, politely, just don't touch Conrad. He should just be forgotten. And in some ways, that for me, that just means like, well, we just have to pretend that the 19th century didn't happen.
Right.
And so a lot of my sources, and I mentioned different ones, are back to that, are from that period. Conrad's novel, Gauguin's paintings, What else did I mention? It's the sort of 1880s, 1890s, Henry Stanley's journals and so on.
So it's not visible in this image, but one element that really struck me in the raft that's in the Thatcher Gallery is the hood, right? And it's a white hood with a pointy top. It's now a lamp cover. But, you know, I actually saw you wear that very hood in your performance at the Richmond Arts Center, where Ubru Wa meets a sort of colonial rhetoric, right? But I think to many viewers who just came into the gallery to see it, it would look like a KKK hood.
Right.
So can you tell us then a little bit about the relationship between Ubu and the performance that you did of Ubu, and then why this hood then gets repurposed into Hafid's raft, his you know, this is his, you know, base camp.
Right. Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, within the U.S., it's sort of impossible to see it as anything else other than a KKK hood. And, you know, what does it mean when this is set, the expedition's set in England as well? One of my immediate visual references is, and actually I brought in a figurine, but I left it back in the gallery in my jacket. I have a little figurine of a Catholic priest from Spain, and I travel regularly to through Seville in south of Spain because my family live in Portugal, and so that's one of where I change planes essentially, and so I always spend time in Seville, and you'll see these images of the priests with their pointed hoods. I mean, they're the image also of the priests from the Inquisition. And you know, you'll see paintings of them in the museums and also just all over the city. And you can buy these little tourist figurines of them as well. And so there's a kind of another context for where the KKK get their uniforms from. You know, and it's a sort of weird mix of the Scottish and the Spanish Inquisition, and yeah, I'm not sure where else. But I was interested in some of those other references as well. As John mentioned, it functions almost as a lamp, and there's an electric cord that goes from the top of the hood that's plugged in, and so there's something horrifying about it. And I'm not totally clear about this. I mean, there are a lot of elements within this whole installation that are connected to different kinds of violence. You know, and there aren't any ways to talk about migration, nationalism, without, you know, it's histories of violence. And I mean, they get played out through performing different kinds of violence onto different kinds of bodies. And so the hood, in this case, is a kind of lamp. You know, you think of the steamboat going through, at least in Conrad, going through the jungle at night, and with its sort of lamps on the side of the boat. And so, you know, what does this mean that there's a hood as a lamp? That it's both, and this is being the base camp that's traveling through London. You know, it's a talisman, it's a warning, it's an image of horror as well. And of course, you know, Conrad's ending point of the novel is the horror. And I think it's also about being completely implicated, like for different viewers, different bodies to be implicated. Like, what does that thing mean to me? And of course, for me, it's an object of absolute horror.
I mean, I think that is so eloquent. There's something about your work which is very conceptual, very complex. Unpacking these maps, it takes work. It's not easily accessible. And yet, one of the things that strikes me about your work is that kind of unflinching willingness to deal with these ghastly histories that we are all the result of, in a way, right? And to talk about your own implication in those histories. And I just find that an incredibly powerful mode of working as a visual artist, and you know, I think it's a very profound and also risky proposition. So I just want to say thank you for doing that and putting yourself into this, putting this work into the world. And I think I've asked enough questions, and I'll let other people try.
But I think there is something there. I mean, you know, there is a risk, and there's a constant risk. And when you're working in a studio, you know, there are those decisions all the time about, well, do I put this in? And like, it's really important to me on you know, a number of levels, but I don't know how viewers will respond to it. And I think there's always that risk. And on the other hand, it's like, I want my work to be in the world and for viewers to respond to it. And I don't control how you respond. But I don't know how else to be in the world.
I don't think there's anything more that needs to be said. I mean, that's an incredible truth in and of itself. So I will open up then the conversation. I'm sure others have questions that you might like to ask, or you probably haven't seen the show yet, but from anything that we've discussed so far, or anything else. Is there anyone who's got a burning question? I can keep asking questions. I'm good at that. I have tons of things I want to ask, but there's others.
Thank you so much. There's so many things that I am so interested in and would like to sort of open up. But before that, I just want to say that I was just in London 2 weeks ago and went to the Masonic Temple and had a wonderful time in their gift store, where you can also see all the capes, the hoods, the aprons, the crosses, all that stuff, the special everything. And I was really intrigued by how the hat makes the man, how people will find some kind of object, costume, mask, and how empowering it is for them. And particularly when they don't have a voice themselves as individuals and they find it as a group, to be able to find some kind of collective identity and strength, and find it in many ways. And that there's that really fantastic early film made about the neo-Nazis in Tracy, in which you see children saying, you know, the Boy Scouts get to wear their uniforms to school, why can't I wear my little Hitler swastika? And the women are making cakes and frosting them with swastikas, and it becomes just kind of a way of presenting themselves without any implication of what it is when these little children and these housewives. But I see that also as relating to this point that you were talking to of taming the wild, and the leopard patterns, and the skinning of the animals, the wearing of, as trophy. I see that very related in an inverted way again. And what I wanted to ask was, if we look at this as a kind of not just taming, but defanging and declawing and really emasculating, how do you see what means for countering that in a sort of positive way for those who are able to articulate that and come out against that?
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Jan. No, that's great. And that's Jan Worm, by the way, who was actually the curator who invited me to do that original performance. So thank you. So there, you know, I think there's a lot there around unmasking, and then, you know, how the mask functions by itself, and presumably then someone has been unmasked in order for you to have that mask. And also, yeah, I mean, you're raising all this, the attention to skin, whether it's in the maps of, you know, Burrow Boogie Woogie, the skin tones. There's also all the plushy toys in the exhibition, which have been turned inside out and restuffed. So there is a real emphasis on skins and skinning, and the skin being the supposed proof of the self, you know, or the proof of one's identity. And of course, that is a fiction as well. And then, you know, to skin one, the idea of skinning is to also really to completely erase somebody. And, you know, we've seen that with the Nazis, as you mentioned, using the skin of Jews as a way to, as a kind of genocidal erasure. It's a complete obliteration of the body, then to take the skin of another. Yes, yeah. One a kind of art historical reference, which is not, you know, within the work, but it's always resonated for me, is the only self-portrait we have of Michelangelo is in the Sistine Chapel, and it's of his skin. And it's himself as Saint Bartholomew. But it's the skin that we know that in a letter to his lover, you know, he talks about this skin as being the true self which he gives to his lover. You know? And so the skin as being the truth of oneself. So that, you know, those things are kind of in the back of my mind. And of course, when one is identified by one's skin color, of course those questions never leave you. And so I think they become explicit and implicit in different ways in my work. And all those, you know, connected questions on unmasking or revealing, you know.
Other questions? All right, we have a quiet crowd. Since no one's got a question right now, I want to ask you about your book. You've got a book coming out this year. Tell us, what have you been working on in that domain?
Okay, so yeah, the book has taken like 2 or 3 years out of my life. It's coming out in October, called How Art Can Be Thought, and it's attempting to provide a language for what happens when we encounter an art object or an art event. It's like, how do we translate what we're seeing or what we're experiencing, both, you know, as the sort of encounter with the work, and if we're experiencing something bodily, how do we translate that into words, and then how do we communicate that experience with somebody else? So it's attempting to sort of bring language to all of those processes. And it's also an attempt to decolonize the encounter with an art object. If, you know, pretty much everyone in this room, if we're primarily educated through, you know, Euro-American art history and its worldview, its language, then, you know, how does that language both enable but also erase other voices? And you know, how can one speak back to that? So actually, back to your question, Jan, it's like, how does one speak back to different kinds of erasure? And you know, I'm trying to do that in artwork, and not do the work for the viewer, but at least provide different kinds of manifestation that can, I guess, begin to be points of discussion, reference. And also, how does the viewer place themselves in relation to the work? Much like the navigation chart that we talked about. You know, when I'm placing myself in relation to that sort of constellation of people, I'm interested in how we place ourselves in relation to artworks. And I guess create agency out of that. So the book is really is very closely linked to how I work as an artist as well, but sort of providing a language for that whole process of making, showing work, speaking about it, and from the agency of decolonizing all those processes.
That sounds great. Sign me up. I'll pre-order on Amazon. I see a question in the back. Bring the mic.
Yes, it is available on Amazon.
Hi. I just had a quick question about the art shown in the gallery in the picture. Are the materials, the 4 materials that are hanging on the wall, is that going to be displayed in what we're seeing, or could you explain it?
So this photograph's from the previous location, but all these elements are here too. Your question was the relationship between what?
I just wondered what they were, what that represented.
The 4 flags.
The flags. Yeah, I mean, they're also maps. I think they function in relation to the base camp also as flags. So the kind of flags that a ship might display, they're maps of London and connect to some of the other maps which are on the walls as well.
All right, well, it seems like it's about time to finish up so we can all go over to look at the work in the flesh, shall we say, and have
the skin.
Yes, have an opportunity to analyze it and experience it for ourselves. It's a very special. I hate that word. It's a very unique set of problems that you present to the viewer, I think, as an artist, and I think that many times the idea about a work of art is that it is either digestible or not, right? It is something I either get or I don't get. And one of the things that I found most fascinating about your work over the years, Allan, is that yours is neither. You can both get it and not get it. And basically every work that I think I've ever seen of yours, I both get and don't get. So as you viewers go over there and try to figure out what you're looking at, realize that this is just a process and that this is not something that will ever end.
And I think there's an opportunity within a sort of university gallery for those of you who are students here that you can keep encountering it, over the duration of the exhibition, which you don't normally get to do, in a museum or commercial gallery. And that's one of the pleasures for me that students and faculty and staff have a really different engagement with the work because there's repeated viewings. And so the meanings change over time as well.
Well, thank you so much, Allan.
Well, thank you, too.